Western Australian government legislated to modernize the electricity grid with an amendment to the state electricity objective. So the first time that's been done in 20 years, further to support distributed energy solutions or consumer energy solutions. So it's an exciting time. There's a lot of movement in the market, and yeah, happy to speak at a high level around what we're seeing. So I suppose it would be obvious to say that the energy transition is underway. There has certainly been an uptick in solar, wind, and storage in terms of renewable solutions, and Australia is a global leader, and equally a downturn in some of the more traditional fossil fuel generation types that we have seen and heard of in the past. Now, this probably isn't a surprise to many of you, but that transition means that we are accelerating in terms of meeting our targets for renewable energy take up, and lots and lots of new programs coming in to support that continuation of the acceleration of that transition. That's the sort of work that our team at Deloitte and Energy and Climate Advisory does day in and day out. In terms of the role of distributed generation, so we refer to distributed energy resources sometimes as consumer energy resources, but they refer to those pieces of equipment that you would see in a more distributed fashion, usually with your own eyes, so not behind equipment in boxes managed by electricians or professional staff, but things that you might have in your home. So solar is a really great example. Battery storage, which you might have in your house, like for example, a Tesla Powerwall is an example, and then electric vehicle and the associated charging or electric vehicle supply equipment also related to that. And we're seeing also a shift to that equipment being installed in businesses as well. So that provides a greater distribution and an opportunity for utilizing that to provide financial benefit in the market. Deloitte was really proud to have contributed to one of the 4 trials that ARENA funded in support of understanding better distributed energy resources and how they support and add value to the grid. So one of them was Project Edged, and last year in partnership actually with Ezra Beeman of Energeia, who's also on the call, we delivered a cost benefit analysis for that particular piece of work. And what that CBA illustrated was that there was up to $6 billion of benefits to all users of electricity within the national electricity market if we can overcome the barriers related to DER or SUR in the NEM and support consumers in the transition. So we've got a couple of details there around what limitations exist currently that are being unpacked, one of which is social license, which I know Laura will speak to briefly, coming out of the RES project, and quite a few others as it relates to market constructs. I won't go into a whole lot of detail around the barriers of the market constructs, but I did mention in particular that one AEMC rule that is an illustration of how slowly but surely we are starting to shape the market in favor of bidirectional flow of energy. So energy traveling both ways, which ultimately will deliver value for all consumers, greater affordability, reliability, and also more sustainable provision of energy at a distributed level. Now, before we sort of jump into vehicle to grid or vehicle to X, important to talk about where electric vehicles can fit in terms of this distributed solution. So EVs, as you know, are accelerating in Australia in terms of their sales. I believe last year it was 7.2 of all new car sales were electric in Australia, and the US has just seen something like, I think it was 12 or 14% of new car sales electric just December of last year. So that the shift moving into mass market is really occurring. And where EVs connect with the grid is sort of 3 kind of key areas that relate to the energy transition. One is charging, so that's public and private charging. You might understand it from the Queensland Electric Superhighway or the Driving the Nation program that's supporting connectivity around Australia, undertaken by the NRMA. So lots of programs happening that enable EVs to connect into the grid in homes or in public locations and draw down energy. Another consideration for electric vehicles as it relates to the grid is the load. So while the charging is highly relevant, EVs can also be used to manage load. So this is where we can time or control the charging to line up really well with when there is excess generation of solar, so periods of minimum demand, for example, or wind, or where we have a need to not necessarily utilize the EV for charging to manage peak demand events, for example, when everyone's kicking up their air conditions on a hot day. So those are two examples. And the third is where we can use the EV to repurpose load. And this is where sort of vehicle to grid starts to unpack some of those concepts. So where we can store energy on board the vehicle and then repurpose that energy at a time when there is a need for that reserve to be utilized or dispatched for another purpose. So while those constructs around EVs and how they interact with the grid are broadly canvassed, then we have this second concept of vehicle to X. And we say X because X could mean anything. It just refers to the transfer of electricity from the EV to another source. Bidirectionally is also how it's referred to. So in this case, and the most often one, the one we'll speak to today, is when the EV takes its energy and sends it back to the grid more broadly. And in that case, quite a lot of things have to line up for that to be a value proposition, both for the customer and for the market. So I'll save the narrative around that for my colleagues who are coming to speak to a bit later today, but just broadly, that's the concept. Another concept that is considered and I think utilized in markets where energy volatility is more of a variable is vehicle to home. So where you can take the energy stored on board in your EV and use it to power your home. So let's say there's an event where you've lost power and just for a couple of hours you need to charge your phone or perhaps kick up your refrigerator. Vehicle to home would provide that service. Vehicle to load is, as you would imagine, supplying the power from the vehicle to any other load that you might require. One point that is referenced is if you're camping, for example, or on a road trip and you need to power something that's perhaps a portable refrigerator or a fan, or again, charging your consumer electronics when you're away, vehicle to load provides that service. There's an excellent story, I think, in the ABC just a couple of months ago about a mother who had powered her son's dialysis machine, I think it was, during a natural weather event where she didn't otherwise have access to electricity. So there's incredible stories here about where this can be really useful and I think necessary in terms of climate resilience as we continue to experience more natural events. And the last is vehicle to vehicle, and I think that one is pretty obvious, although it's probably not the most widely referenced example of where vehicle to X can be useful. Just wanted to call out that there are still quite a few barriers to enabling vehicle to grid. I won't go into a whole lot of detail because, as I said, I think my colleagues will pick that up, but we still haven't really nailed the market arrangements for supporting vehicle to grid and realizing the true value from it in Australia, although that is underway. So quite a bit to think about in terms of standards and certification as it relates not just to preparing the grid to accept what the vehicle will do, but also thinking about the connection standards around communication protocols and also the charging connector that still hasn't quite been nailed in Australia. We also have a need to look at policy frameworks, tariff design, security. I mean, obviously, cybersecurity is on our minds a lot these days. We get, I don't know about you, but I feel like I get a robocall or a text message sort of twice a week, but making sure that the information that is provisioned when the vehicle connection occurs is managed. And also the customer experience. Technical requirements, I think, are quite obvious, but the customer experience is an important one as well, and one that often gets missed as we talk excitedly about the value that can be generated through these new concepts. So certainly drawing that out as something that needs to remain a focus. And last, just a couple of stats here around, the opportunity. I won't speak to this in great detail because I think these come out of Jon's reports, but there is an excellent sort of data set here to say this is worth doing. Tremendous value if we can get it right. And like with all things, it's just a matter of coordinating the various bits and pieces to line up to the market opportunity. So really excited to be part of the discussion and part of the transition. And I'm really looking forward to hearing from my colleagues around their work. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, Alina. That was great. We have a bit of time if anyone has any questions that can be pointed towards Alina. I maybe kick us off. I have one. Just wondering what your view on the sort of timeline of V2G going mainstream is. Do you have a projection on that?
Well, I think before we can enable V2G to go mainstream, we have to get EVs into mainstream. So there's sort of that first critical step, and we're not quite there yet. I think we're in a really exciting tipping point in the market where we've sort of eclipsed the early adopter phase of electrification of vehicles, at least for passenger vehicles in Australia. But we now sort of have that middle of the road transition before we get to mainstreaming. And what is required to achieve that is, I think, the various connectors in the ecosystem to make EVs truly accepted. So that includes all of the facilities that you would use when you use a traditional vehicle and energy paradigms. So your retailers, insurers, financiers, parking, even some of the social norms around, if I pull into an EV charging station and there is a bike parked there, what do I do? So getting around some of those day-to-day barriers that we're still experiencing, I think is necessary, but certainly coming very quickly. So beyond that, I think vehicle to grid, probably a few years off.
Yeah. No, awesome. Sounds like there's a lot of broader work to be done around this space. I think Tim has a question, or he has his hand up. Tim?
Oh, just a quick point was I just want to pick Alina up on the definition of vehicle to home and vehicle to grid. I think vehicle to home is understood as being synchronous and connected to the grid at the same time, and the grid is balancing the load and service around it. The backup portion, if it does happen, is generally only part of the load, and which would be better considered vehicle to load. But consumers are more likely to adopt the benefits of using their battery if it's behind the meter and it's their own use, rather than trying to say it has to be delivered to the grid.
I think that's a fair point. It's also worth mentioning that we're seeing a lot of residences now choosing to go off grid, or have regional customers that might not benefit from those kinds of arrangements. So having the optionality certainly makes sense.
Just to add to that, not a topic for now, but I think the idea of encouragement of off grid and that EVs can deliver that is not appropriate, particularly in the wider construct that the network as a community commons. It's a shared benefit to all and a shared responsibility.
Yeah, certainly. And I wasn't advocating for it, just commenting that it's one aspect of it. I, for example, have a property regionally that we attend that's off grid, and so having the ability to use my vehicle bidirectionally for that purpose would be very helpful.
Awesome. Okay, John, I think you've got a question or your hand raised. John Clifford. Can hear you. I think you might be on mute or you're not coming through. It's all right. We might move along, John, and come back to you in a minute. Is there any other questions for Alina? No. Awesome. Well, okay, we've got Satish.
Hello. I was just wondering, what are the grid upgrade plans for accommodating V2G and V2X for that matter? Because we are seeing that the grid needs to update for EVs, and now we have V2X, which probably will benefit the grid in some way. Is there any particular plan or actions happening on that side?
Yeah, there's quite a bit underway, and it's a reasonably detailed response, I think, that I believe Jon's report and possibly Ezra's picks up in a bit more detail. So I might leave that for them to not sort of jump ahead, and also they'll have the most relevant and up-to-date information.
Beautiful. Awesome. Well, keep putting your questions in the Q&A function, and we're going to have a bit more of a detailed discussion at the end with the panel. So we might move along now. Thank you, Alina. That was great. Laura Jones from ANU. You got your slides up and ready?
I do. Let me just share my screen and then we can start. Right. Can people see my screen? Cool. Good to know it works. Hi, I'm Laura. I was just asked to give a very short 5-minute presentation on REVS, which was a ARENA-funded project that would be about this time last year, and provided some of the data that underpins some of the other reports. So I'm just giving a 5-minute whistle-stop tour of some of the findings that we've had from the project. Now, the project was around $7 million project, which ARENA threw $2.4 million towards. So thank you so much for the support. Essentially, what we did was we took 51 vehicle-to-grid capable electric vehicles and chargers and taught them to do contingency frequency control and stuck them in a fleet and then see what happens. It was kind of like a complex trial as kind of a first vehicle to grid attempt. So I always say it took 2.5 years of a 2-year project to get the chargers installed, just because of the complexities involved in that process. There was a fairly significant research component to it, which is kind of one reason why there's so many reports and various other things floating around from the project. I think Ezra is going to take you through some of the findings of what came from the chargers that were installed, because the chargers were installed a little late for us to put too many of the real findings from that in our report. So we based our analysis off of other data, like, for example, vehicle location data and things like that. We wrote a fair few reports, 11 of them to be exact. You can download them by scanning that QR code or going to the Arena website and having a look. I'm going to take you through a couple of key findings from a few of those reports now, and hopefully maybe entice you to read some of those reports that might be interesting later. First was technical. So we got these chargers installed, one of them in our DER lab, which has a grid simulator connected to it, so we can make grid disturbances happen and see what the charger does. The idea of frequency control ancillary services, or FCAS, is that the charger rapidly charges or discharges in the event of grid disturbance. Turned out it was a little slower than we thought it was going to be. It took around 4.5 to 5 seconds for the charger to respond to a frequency event. I suspect it's related to how the internal control loops inside the charger works. And then there was a little niggly in the AS4777 standard that made its response to frequency going down, so the kind of events we'd expected to increase its power, exceptionally slow. My understanding is that that is being addressed in the next version of AS4777 that's currently being considered. So hopefully that's going to be fixed in the future. But, you know, you kind of got this view where the charger wasn't as good at its frequency control as we thought it was going to be. They were a new technology too, so they were kind of unreliable and were prone to bricking themselves, but hopefully next versions are not quite that like that. We did people research too. So there were 2 different streams where we spoke to people. We spoke to people to ideate some business models, and we spoke to people who might be potential users of vehicle to grid in the future, and asked them what they thought about it. It's interesting. I think Alina said vehicle to home. That was certainly something that came out of our research. Vehicle to home is like quite attractive to private EV owners. The idea of vehicle to grid, a bit less so. It was also quite interesting when we were speaking to people. They said a lot of the kind of summary was like, oh, vehicle to grid's a great idea for this other people, but not for me. And then you go speak to the other people and they'll be like, oh no, vehicle to grid's a great idea for these other people. So we kind of got these themes of like, it's a great idea for someone else. When we kind of talked through what people's expectations were, there was a lot of these discussions around seamless. They expect vehicle to grid to be seamless. This probably applies for both the energy industry participants who want to buy services from people who own vehicle to grid vehicles and the EV drivers themselves. So EV owners want to drive, fleet managers want vehicles that don't cause them trouble because they're flat when the people want to drive them. DNSPs want rock solid performance guarantees. Everyone thinks that energy retailers' needs come last, but they kind of like the idea of certainty as well. So the question kind of is, how does this some intermediary that like the aggregator make all of this certainty happen from what's kind of a bit of an uncertain asset because it drives off from time to time? We also modelled vehicle to grid. So we based this on mostly telematics data, so location data from vehicles, so how the ACT government historically used their vehicles. We modelled a couple of different things. So people said if emissions was important to them, people said cost was important to them, people said certainty was important to them. So this graph kind of attempts to show you how those 3 values interplay. So reducing cost you can do, reducing emissions you can do. That turned out they were quite different. So you were doing different things with your EV. Now there are different ways you can measure emissions. We used marginal emissions. You could model a different way if you wanted to. Comfortingly, reserving some of your battery for driving doesn't necessarily reduce the value that much, which is probably a nice finding to have. We also installed chargers in the real world. That was, as I said, a bit of a fraught process. It took quite a long time to get the chargers installed and working. The things that were a bit tricky, we said we were putting these vehicles into a fleet. It turned out we were putting them into fleets. So there was more than one fleet manager. They all had different expectations and drivers, and that was quite a bit of a stakeholder challenge. There's also the fact that there are other stakeholders that are important in fleets, like building owners and facilities managers and energy purchasing managers and all of those people. So I think this kind of aligns with a lot of the other fleet trials we've found where stakeholder management for electric vehicles in fleets is a bit tricky. AS4777 compliance took about 3 goes through the lab, which added a bit of extra time. The installation was tricky in commercial buildings. No one built car parks assuming that you're going to have wires run out to all of the cars. And there's a little interesting one that came out at the end. There are standards relating to phase unbalance for batteries. Normally, if it's a battery, the battery is there and it stays connected. If it's a vehicle, the battery drives off sometimes, and you can't really control which phase the battery drives off from. So that caused a few little tricky bits when it came to phase unbalance, because it might be that all of the people connected to phase A happen to be the ones who drove off, and that creates unbalance. Vehicle usage, we assume that people use booking systems for vehicles, and it turns out that most of them don't. So that kind of reduced the quality of the data which you could build bidding engines on. This and more is in our reports. So feel free to have a read of them, or we can have questions at the end, I guess. I'll stop sharing my screen now, and I don't know if we have questions now or at the end, but either way, I'm happy to answer some.
Thanks, Laura. That sprint to reps and compressing 5 years worth of knowledge into 5 minutes was amazing. I think it's fair to say that back in the day, we underestimated the complexity of putting all this together. The ACT world was coming back of the experience of installing 50 charging stations and getting a few cars with different buildings. What can go wrong, right? We just have to put bi-directional chargers and maybe change the standard. There's got to be a regulation there. I know there's people from Jet Charge and also people from Act2HEL in the call. They were definitely not happy. But thanks to all these great group of people that put all the time to make this happen, now this project is a reality. So that's just raising ambitions, and whenever something seems too complicated or too awkward, yes, there's going to be challenges, but if you have enough people and enough willing power, definitely we can change these through. I'm not sure, Anthony, do we have some time to get some questions from the
we have a bit of time for questions. There was one in the chat I saw that was asking what were the bidirectional chargers being used? Were they wall boxes?
Yeah, they were wallbox quasars. They were CHAdeMO chargers. I don't think you can buy them anymore. I think the manufacturer has stopped making them. So yeah, I'm sure. I think there's a second version coming out soon, and I suspect that one will be CCS, which supports vehicle to grid or bidirectional charging now. So yeah, I expect we'll see more of them in the future.
Yep. And on that, there was another question in the chat that was asking about what the testing was during the commissioning to find out if the devices were performing as required by 4777, the new edition of it.
That was done by a European test lab. I can't remember the exact standards, the exact tests that they did, but they were just the ones that you use to validate any other inverter against AS4777. A couple of the tricky things were the version of the AS4777 standard talked about battery earthing, but you know, the vehicle's on rubber wheels, so it doesn't have an earth. So that caused a couple of nigglies, for example.
Awesome. Daniel's got his hand up. Question.
Thanks, Laura. That's really fascinating stuff. I was just wondering, with the whole your research on the not in my backyard from a residential kind of perspective, do you see scope for this to be rolled out more in kind of your train station park and ride, or at shopping centres, that kind of thing, where they would have more ability to utilise it?
Yeah, so a lot of people ideated those kinds of business models to me when I was doing the business model research, talking about maybe you can pay for your parking with vehicle to grid. And it's not to say like EV owners are against it. They probably are quite attracted to vehicle to home, but less so vehicle to grid. One of the things that actually turned out, like when it comes to you drive somewhere and you use vehicle to grid to pay for parking or whatever, now there is, because vehicle to grid's a new thing, Nissan essentially needs to specifically approve every use of vehicle to grid. So you need to tell them how they want to use the vehicle, and they'll kind of tell you whether that fits under the warranty or not. If you think of a future environment where there's vehicle to grid everywhere, you've got these questions around you're plugging your vehicle in at work and their vehicle to gridding away and using some of your battery cycles up. Then you go do your shopping and they use up a few more. Then you go home and use up a few more overnight. And you might end up like essentially the lifetime is perhaps one of the concerns that comes up, and how, as a driver, when you're plugging into something that's going to do vehicle to grid, do you know what that impact is? So there are probably some warranty things that would need to be worked out, I suspect. Not to say it's impossible. It's just like that's just a thing that we want to think about, I suspect. Does that answer your question? Yep.
Yeah, I think so. It's fascinating with how the longevity of batteries is really developing now, with CATL offering 800,000 kilometer warranties on the EV batteries. So it'll be interesting to see how that plays out.
Yeah, and absolutely, like the jury's kind of a little bit out as to whether vehicle to grid does reduce battery life very much, depending on how you use it. Like there are some studies that tell you the fact that you're not keeping the battery full all the time is actually a benefit for battery health. So yeah, the jury's out a little bit. But I guess, you know, from a person who owns an EV, it might not necessarily be informed by research. It might simply be the fact of, well, I don't know what this thing has on my vehicle, and it was kind of an expensive thing I don't want to see wrecked.
Yeah, super interesting. So Jackson's asked in the chat the big question, and it's where are we going from here? And what do you think the next steps are?
For vehicle to grid?
Yes.
Yeah. Look, I mean, Revs was a trial, and I think it was a worthwhile trial because we found like a lot of things that we need to work out. I think it's probably a thing that's going to become a bit more available in the future. I suspect the things that we will want to be working out is kind of like, if we think that they're going to be connecting to the grid, we need to work out how that works from like a consumer or fleet owner point of view. Revs, we did contingency frequency control FCAS mostly because we could say, hand on heart, fleet manager, we are not going to discharge your battery. Now, when we're talking about these, because like if frequency control events are rare, right? And when they do happen, they only have like a tiny amount of energy that you're discharging from the battery. If we're thinking of taking vehicle to grid in a more dynamic sense, where you're doing energy market participation and that kind of thing, that's probably a little more of a tricky sell. And I suspect that there's going to be some work in trying to make that work from the point of view of EV owners, if that makes sense.
That's a great segue to remember that at the end of the 4 presentations, we're going to have these 4 experts responding all your questions, but that was the first one. So this is just a teaser of what's coming next. And just this, I see a few hands up and a number of questions in the chat. Just hold later, and then we're going to get back to those questions at the end. I think that is good to get Ezra, and just as an intro to the report that he's going to be presenting. This was really interesting because we unfortunately wasn't able to the project in Arena. It was a 5-year project, and on those years we were fixing so many issues that by the time the project finished, we still haven't been able to put the vehicles doing the vehicle to grid for real. Everything was tested in the lab, and then we always wondered what happened at the end of the project when the vehicles actually were connected to the grid. The assumptions that we had initially were actually what happened in the real world, or were there anything more or less? Just as a segue, when we started in the ACT government thinking, why do we have to do this? The fleet managers were a bit defensive on getting electric vehicles, mainly for cost reasons. So the company that was leasing the electric vehicles to them was charging, and in some instances, more than $3,000 per annum, comparing just a Toyota Corolla with a Hyundai Ioniq, for example. And I just thought it was a good idea to get some extra cash by plugging them into the grid when they're not in use. But I was a very optimistic thinking on my side, and I wasn't sure if it was going to be ever a reality or not. But apparently it is, and apparently too, it's a bit more attractive than we thought initially was. So Ezra, without further warning, the microphone is yours, and go for it.
Thanks, Adrian, and thanks to Arena for the opportunity to present on our findings from the analysis today. And it is great to see such a big ecosystem forming around this. It's probably the most frequently asked question I'm getting at the moment, which is, what do you think of vehicle to grid's outlook. And it's interesting that people have very different positions on this, and they're coming from different places. I'm probably on the more aggressive and optimistic side of the coin, but I think Eric, who did most of the work for this project, is more on the I would say conservative side of the spectrum. So within the same office, in the same business, you can actually have a dichotomy of views. And a lot of the reason for that is we just don't have a lot of data. And what projects like this really help do is start to put that data into the public domain. And so it's great to be able to bring that to you today. All right, now all I have to do is share my screen. So I'm going to So in terms of an agenda, I'm going to quickly talk to the trial context. I'm not going to get into a lot of detail. I think Laura knows 10 times more about the detail around the trial, but to pick out some of the key elements that then feed into our analysis. And that includes some of the data quality considerations that need to be factored in, what we found in terms of the charging behavior, and then how we use that to then model what the potential vehicle to grid benefits could be if you were to use vehicle to grid to provide FCAS or frequency control ancillary services. So let's start, and I'll go to full screen here, except for I have to. So just to summarize, ANU was looking to test. Sorry, not even sure what's going on there. ANU was looking to test whether vehicles could be used via an intermediary platform to provide services to the market, and in particular, ancillary services. You have on the bottom left how the technology was fitted together, that you basically had a grid simulator who could inject perturbations, and you had an FCAS controller all interacting with the bidirectional EV charger. Now, of the full, the scope of what the REVS trial was aiming to do, we're really just focused on its implications for the business case and also our quantification of the economic potential. So for those of you that haven't had the pleasure of learning more about ancillary services, particularly frequency control ancillary services, I'm probably not the right person to learn it from. But what we do have here is a helpful graphic that talks about how when you have a grid disturbance, it can impact on frequency, and how the range of ancillary services are used to recover from the excursion, the frequency excursion, and to get it back to whatever the target frequency is, in this case, 50 hertz. Now, there are two categories of ancillary services. Regulation, which is there to really deal with short-term variations between demand and supply, which are mostly due to forecasting errors and not due to contingency events. And then there are the contingency ancillary services, and those are only there as reserves in case there is some major or significant event to either demand or supply. And they come in different flavors. The slowest contingency event has a 5-minute response time. You've got 60 seconds, 6 second, and the newly created 1 second. And using that portfolio of contingency reserves, AMO is able to deliver a secure, reliable system. So most of what non-large-scale generators are bidding into is the contingency market, and there's a couple of reasons for that. One is just the regulations, which generally do not allow you to distributed resources to participate in regulation. But the other is that with contingency, you can kind of eat your cake and have it too. And the reason for that is you get paid on the potential for there to be a contingency event. And when that contingency event occurs, then yes, you may have to raise or you may have to lower. But unlike the regulation frequency control ancillary services, where you have a set point and it's constantly moving up or down, and it's difficult to use that resource for other things when you're actually significantly charging or discharging as a result. All right, so let's talk about the data quality. So, I mean, it's been a pleasure to have a chance to look at this data. It's something that we have wondered about in terms of, will vehicles have the right duty cycle? How often is the contingency event going to be called? How long does it occur? This is information that is very difficult to get outside of trials like these. And so in this trial, relatively comprehensive in that there were 51 chargers over 11 different sites. And what we've done we've laid them out here, showing you and also categorizing for you, thanks to the data provided by the pilot, that there was a mix of government offices, healthcare, nature conservation, and also a commercial office. So, a decent range of different kinds of offices with a strong focus on healthcare. But not all of the locations had all of the data available, and this was really an outcome or result of this being, a trial, a pilot. This is cutting edge, and doing anything out there in the field is really challenging. I had the opportunity to roll out smart metering at Ausgrid back in 2005, and we learned what not to do the hard way, for the first 250 installations. So really getting out this technology, being the first out there to do it, it comes with risks, and you can see here that the risk manifested by not being able to get in all those chargers at the target date. So we don't have complete information, but we have most of the information, or a lot of the information. The other thing to draw to your attention is the information was collected, or at least provided to us, only when there was a charge or a discharge event. And so if nothing's happening at one of these sites, then there's no data for it. And you can see the activity was really focused in a couple of key buildings being indicated there. And so just bear that in mind when you see the results. It does draw from government offices and health center buildings, as well as the Nature Conservatory. But the data for the commercial office, for example, isn't really reflected. In terms of where the actual locations are, you can see in the relatively compact area that is surrounding Canberra that they are in these geographic locations. So we're not going to get a lot of geographic diversity in terms of the response, but I don't believe that that's really a material factor when considering the potential for for V2G to play in the FCAS market. Okay, so I think there are probably 2 or 3 key questions about V2G and how it's going to support or provide grid and market services. One, of course, is how much of the battery are you going to be able to tap into, and how much risk on that are you going to, or is going to be possible to take? The other one, of course, is when is that battery available? And so in this trial, there was a booking system whereby the vehicle can say, hey, we're going to book this time out. And therefore it wasn't available for the FCAS market, which is pretty real world. In other cases, and I think, 29 out of 51 didn't participate in that booking system, and so we had to make an assumption about their level of participation, which is provided there, that they would be in use from 8 a.m. to 5 p.m. Again, I think this speaks to the need for systems to better enable when these vehicles are available. And I'm sure they're out there, but I haven't personally seen any sort of booking systems, and it would stand to reason. I believe the analytics will get good enough that it can try and learn all this. But in the short term, it would be pretty useful to have this to try and manage resource availability, and to then start developing the analytics to predict it. Now you can see here hours of vehicles that are booked. It shows some of them are quite heavily used, others not so much. Again, this is to give you a feeling for the data upon which we do the analysis. So let's now turn to the action, being charging and discharging. So let's start with charging. So this basically reflects a workplace charging profile. People may drive the vehicles from home, and so when they get in, they start charging in the morning. Also, when they're done at the end of day, they might be charging at that time as well. Commercial vehicles have a reputation for being vehicles that are parked at work tend to be expected to be plugged in during the day and tend to have a stronger overlap with the solar PV generation, and that's generally a positive thing. Whether or not that particular part of the network is constrained during commercial times is a different sort of issue. In terms of when the charging session started, I think one of the interesting things about this particular fleet is just the level of utilization. I mean, this isn't long haul trucking, so these batteries are not depleted every day. You can see here that most of the time when they were charging, they were more than 70% full. So, 30%, only 30% of them weren't already 70, 80% full when they got recharged. So almost like a float charge. You can see on the bottom right, the session start. So when they got plugged in, where were they at? And by the end of the session, where were they at? And sort of the timing of that charging activity. Looking at discharging, now this is where it's a bit more interesting. You can see the discharging sessions. They are related to the charging sessions because you have to be plugged in, but they were a little bit different. And then if we look at what the state of charge was, SOC, when they were discharging, again, most of them were already at 70 to 80% full when the discharge occurred. You can see here during the AS event, the ancillary services events, there was only a very small amount of discharge occurring. Session start shows one level, session finish shows another. So these did not put a huge taxation onto the batteries in providing these services. If you look at then average power consumption and how that compares to the total percent annual charge. So apologies, a little bit complex here. On the left side, you've got the percentage of annual charge. And this is really, the reason we look at it like this is to just get the pure shape of whatever the activity is. And so on average, most of the charging was occurring by about 11 a.m. and then it started to die, reduce around 6 p.m. In the evening. For the average power. For the percentage of annual charge, it's a thinner sort of shape. On the graphic below, you can see the difference between average power and annual charge, and the difference is annual charge would vary by location, just depending on how much it's used. But while it's being used, it shows a pretty consistent average power. I'm not totally sure why some of those locations on the right side have power that's much lower, but they certainly weren't doing a lot of energy at that power. Okay, on the discharging side, not as regular as the consumption or as the charging, but again, this is really in response to the frequency disturbances. And here you have again the average power and the average discharge, and the discharge is just much lower. I think you'll note that you go from 2000 to 5. So again, that reflects a difference between providing charging for energy for driving versus actually providing the ancillary service. In terms of the grid start events, by start times, you can see them in the bottom right. Then this is just the distribution of when the grid events occurred. So turning to the average weekday charging profile by building, this is as much a reflection of the number of vehicles at the site as anything else. Generally a dip around 2 p.m. Not sure why, but probably operational reasons. And then the discharge profile is much spikier because it's just responding to discrete FCAS events that are not terribly well correlated in terms of their magnitude and their timing. All right, so that was all of the underlying data that we then used to apply to historical FCAS prices. Now, at the moment, and for the last couple of years, we've had some pretty significant wholesale prices in Australia, driven in part by increased global commodity prices, in part driven by the war in Europe or in Ukraine. And so these, the results here are benefiting, I guess, from that. And as prices change, they're going to look considerably different. So what we have here, top left, is just showing the percentage of vehicles not available due to the booking or the assumed booking. And so if you sort of apply that to the total vehicles available for FCAS raise, it shows that between say 8 and 4, you've got basically 100 kilowatts just from this little fleet, compared to maybe a nameplate capacity about 350. And then you can see the prices by hour for all of the different raise products, including regulation. And what you can see here is the regulation is much higher on average than any of the others. Now, one thing I'm still not really sure I understand is why isn't it, if regulation, which is the fast acting and most demanding, and I can understand why it's high, you've got 6-second raise. Well, I suppose it's following the right order of things. So the more stringent performance requirements, the 6-second is higher on average than the 60-second, which is a higher on average on the 5-minute. This is not always the case, but I'm glad to see it working here. Now, the other thing to point out, we're using the 2022 data set. 2023 prices have come down, but I think 2022 was one of the higher years, and that even in 2021 they were lower. Although Eric, you might want to step in and correct me if I've got that backwards. All right, on the lower side, similar amounts of availability. There's 7 kilowatts of nameplate per car. And you see the average lower price by hour. And the V2G, assuming it's not completely empty or completely full, can do both charge or discharge. The fact that they're mostly full means that discharge is going to be something they could do a lot of, and actually their scope for doing charging is limited by how much capacity they have left. But because these are such short events, it's not such an issue. For regulation, it would be more of an issue. Now, bringing those two elements together, the FCAS prices and the actual timing of the events, we calculated that had they been in the market, that they would be earning on a potential revenue per. Well, first of all, you could look at it just in terms of the amount over from the trial, almost $1 million there, or sorry, 0.338 million for lower regulation. That translates to roughly about $9,000 per year per car. You get a lot less for the others, and here you can see that just the combination of the number of events called and the pricing at the time, that the lower 60-second here was more valuable than either the lower 5-minute or the lower 6-second response. I was expecting there to be a FCAS raise. So if we were to just summarize what we've covered, and then I'm looking forward to questions, in terms of the actual charging behavior itself, that the charging occurred within a typical window for work charging. Half of the charging, half of the sessions started when they had a state of charge between 70 and 90%. And half of the discharging started when they had a state of charge which was greater than 90%. So again, you had a lot of capacity able to be bid in, particularly for raise. We also found that there was little variation in profile across building type. It was really a magnitude thing if you had more vehicles. In terms of the amount of energy exported and depletion of the battery, it's relatively small. Not, you could round that up to 1% of the total energy. So to the extent that you are participating in a contingency event, it's probably light work for this particular application. If you were to do regulation, it is likely to be a lot more energy. So to the extent that these price levels hold and this number of frequency events holds, then it looks like using vehicles or offering vehicles into the FCAS market could be a significant revenue generator, provided that all these previous assumptions hold. That you could have earned a significant amount in 2022. However, that would be in the regulation market, and if you looked at the the contingency market, you're looking more like 2,600, and that's whether you did raise or lower. So even at $2,000 a year, that's at least beer money, if not petrol money. So I think the final point is the one I might spend a moment on. How long ancillary services represent roughly about 2.5% of total energy in a given market, and they're really there as operating reserves. And generally, before we had a market, the ancillary services were only a very small fraction of the cost of generation. But because they are quite stringent in terms of the metrology involved and the equipment needed to participate and the frequency response time. They tend to maybe create a little bit of a barrier to entry, and so we're seeing persistently high prices, even higher than we see in the energy market. And a key question is, how long is that going to persist? And I think our view at the moment is that so long as we are continuing this transition and increasing the amount of intermittent resources, which are the fundamental drivers of the need for reserves, that we can expect prices to stay pretty strong. Now, to the extent that large-scale batteries catch up and surpass the rate of growth of say, solar connections or wind connections, then you could see a dip as supply outstretched demand. But you really have to take a close look at the project pipeline to take a view on that. All right, well, I'll leave it there. Thanks again for listening, and look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Ezra. I think we've had a bit of an allergic reaction to your use of the word petrol money in the chat.
Oh, no.
But we're happy to field any questions. I see David has his hand up, if you want to start us off.
Usual. I did put my hand down and then put it up again, because I think you actually answered my question in your last few sentences, because my question was going to be, to what extent actually having this new capacity available in the FCAS market will itself drive down price? Although it's all very well saying there's this price that everybody can get, but once people start coming in, that just changes everything, and that itself puts the price down. And I think you said, well, look at the market, you think the market will stay up. I mean, I was then going to put my hand down, and I thought, look, I'll put it up again and ask you, what sort of time scale for that are you thinking of? Are you thinking of long term, short term, like in 5 to 10 years time? Will this be so commonplace it'll hardly be worth it? That kind of thing.
I think 10 years will start to probably come down on any sort of significant activity. A lot of this is really driven by the level of intermittent resources and the supply and demand. Sorry, and then the supply of firming resources, right? So I think markets can tend to balance when there's not a lot of dynamic change, but right now we're having to swap out the whole generating fleet. And so as that's occurring, and plus we've got transmission access questions, et cetera, I think there is much greater chance of having a mismatch between demand and supply over the next 5, potentially 10 years. And then after that, we're operating at 100% renewable energy or pretty close to it. We've got all of the batteries and the fast response stuff. You've got all the vehicles now able to do it. I would imagine at that point, this becomes, almost like AS 4777 and a service that's just happening in the background.
Awesome. I think Nick's got his hand up.
Sorry, just wanted to interject. I think the FCAS raise slide might have accidentally got cut. Do you want me to share my screen and show that, Ezra?
Sure. I mean, I think it looks a lot like the FCAS lower. Yeah, I was expecting to see it there. So maybe I hit
different quantities.
Hidden.
Yeah, I think so. I'll just share my screen. Oh.
So Nick is the analyst at Energeia that did the analysis, which is why.
Sorry,
Knows it should be there.
I'm locked out from sharing my screen. I'll just send you the version and you can.
That's okay, Nick. The
I think we just
report's
keep going.
up on the knowledge bank, so I've popped the link in the chat, so everyone's welcome to go have a look, download, share on. And that goes through this report in a lot more detail and emphasizes the great analysis that Energeia did. Tim, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, Ezra just touched on this question that I was leading to in the Q&A on. Are we going to get to look? If you look at AS4777 now, there's an awful amount of autonomous and unrewarded response in the operation of inverters that are coming off solar. And the question is are we going to end up with a situation, I suppose, with EVSEs where you plug it in and it's part of the service that you're providing? And that led to my other question in the Q&A on the lighthouse future. What is the future where we're going to? And do we sort of try and plan for that now and have realistic expectations of what we expect out of this and dominance perhaps of vehicle to home over vehicle to grid, support of the grid and the services that go with it, rather than just trying to work out how we make markets and businesses for people to make money rather than consumers to save?
I think there's about 5 questions in there. I mean, the issue about the age. So I had a discussion with a transmission business 2 days ago about whether it was fair for folks who had bought something with an inverter and they're a part of the network that has got voltage issues and they're constantly, exporting reactive power and not getting paid for it, and that's reducing what they can do. But there are generators have obligation, large scale generators have obligations about how they have to operate as well. And I guess I don't have an answer for you there, Tim. I think in the near term, what we're trying to do is allow a lot more devices to connect and to play nicely together and to maintain what is the, plug and play comes from the electricity system. And that really needs to be maintained as we get all this new fancy stuff coming on that's interactive.
Beautiful. Awesome. And Tim, you can hold on to your other 4 questions for the end when we have our panel discussion. Mark's got his hand up. We might just have one last question, Mark.
I'm Mark Regan from Flinders University. We're doing a 10 charger, 13-inch vehicle trial, and we're principally doing it on a microgrid, on our university microgrid. It's a little bit more controlled than the ANU work. But I'm wondering about if we wanted to play an FCAS with that already built, wouldn't it make sense to also have kind of a stationary battery blended with this? And my broader question would be for commercial industrial customers in the future. I mean, I could see we're getting benefits out of using the batteries locally in a microgrid with about 110 buildings. But I could see commercial industrial customers ultimately kind of creating their own blend of storage and generation portfolio. And then having FCAS just be kind of a financial kicker to it. But any thoughts on how the commercial industrial market might evolve?
So, I mean, the thing about the industrial market, it is so specific to exactly what industry it's representing. I mean, we've done work for transmission companies where we looked at all of their regional connections and we we estimated the potential for behind the meter resources to save them money, to allow them to go off grid, et cetera. And I think that really is just a function of what their current costs are and what the alternative costs are, how much land they have, et cetera. I think what the potentially an interesting angle on all of that, particularly when fleets are involved, is the relationship between your value of reliability, which can change if you're a logistics business and all you do is drive around. And so having that power on maybe more than your level of reliability on the rural feeder you're on or in warehouse district, whatever, is higher. And so you might justify significant backup generation or storage to ensure you've got the target level of reliability. Now, as long as you need a fixed level of reliability, there will be periods over the year when you've got battery capacity that's not needed. And the more advanced, I guess, work we've been doing with clients is looking at understanding what that excess is, because you're building for the peak worst time of the year, right? And the rest of the time you'll have spare capacity. And how do you then monetize that in the market?
Awesome. Well, that's great. We might just wrap up the questions for now, but keep popping them through in the chat and we'll return to them later on. Thank you, Ezra. That was fantastic. We now have Jon Sibley, so I'll pass over to you on the mic and share your screen.
Right. Hello, everyone. Hopefully you can see my screen okay. Yeah, so we've just published a report for Arena looking at network tariffs for vehicle to grid. It's got about 8 slides or so that I've run you through one particular sort of thread through that report. It's a pretty big report. I think it's like over 80 pages. There's a lot of material in there. Yeah, and this follows on from a previous report that we ran, we prepared for Arena in 2023, which looked at the overall market context for vehicle to grid in Australia. So I can just get the controls happening in the slides. So why focus on vehicle to grid? So in our previous report, we did some a number of series of modelling where we looked at what the size of the potential is in the Australian market, and also what the value is to consumer on the different kind of, different sets of assumptions and in different jurisdictions. So the headline, as Alina mentioned earlier, is really that just the size of the EV battery fleet in Australia is going to be enormous. So nearly 4 times the national electricity market's total storage requirements, including hydro and batteries and all those kinds of things. So there is, in theory, this huge potential. And when we look at the cost of that, we see that the cost of that is actually relatively low. So about 6% of the cost of large-scale battery storage. That's because people are buying these batteries to drive the car, not to provide energy services. And their ability to provide those energy services an ancillary benefit. The cost to activate that benefit is really just the cost of getting a bidirectional charger. So it's a huge opportunity. It could be the largest resource in our energy transition. We found that V2G is such a flexible resource that it really benefits. It thrives under very dynamic pricing situations, which can, in response to the vehicle, can obviously be automated to respond to dynamic pricing. So that includes both spot market pricing as well as network pricing. So the more pointy the pricing, the better vehicle to grid performs. So I'll go into why that's the case in a second. But really fundamentally, there's a bit of a chicken and egg problem with vehicle to grid. So the supply is quite nascent, both of the vehicles and the chargers, because OEMs are really waiting for policy and consumer engagement with this issue. And similarly, policy and consumers are looking at the space and say, well, there aren't any cars or chargers at the moment, so there's no point in acting now. So we really wanted to, I guess, help bust open that egg and pluck out that little chicken and put it in the incubator and let it thrive. And so a lot of our recommendations in that report are around how we can do that. In terms of why network tariffs, and to really understand this concept of cost-reflective network tariffs. So the National Electricity Rules requires that networks transition to cost-reflective network tariffs. So those are basically established in relation to the long-run marginal cost of the network, and there's economic theory behind that which says that that's how you simulate a competitive market context, where basically the price of a service represents the cost of that service. And if we can achieve that, then we know we're getting efficient pricing, efficient outcomes for the use of that service. So, and ultimately, these consumers aren't paying for more than they should. To date, this has resulted in the rollout of time of use pricing, which everyone would be familiar. Some of that's evolving to bidirectional time of use pricing, such as in the SAPN network and Ausgrid network, where you can get paid by the network to export at peak times and get charged a bit for exporting during the day. But time of use tariffs aren't actually cost reflective, and this is obviously a fairly contentious point, but if you really drill down to it, they're a massive compromise on the marginal pricing principle. and they really, at any one point in time, they massively overcompensate or undercompensate consumers for their charging or discharging behaviour, or they overcharge or undercharge consumers for the use of the network. So, for example, if you have a 30 cents per kilowatt hour evening peak charge for imports during the evening, on most days, most times of the year, when there's heaps of capacity on the network, which is just sitting there utilised, there's actually no marginal cost to the network of you importing power at that time. So the network should, in theory, be free to use. However, during those critical peaks that happen, maybe a few days a year, or maybe a few weeks a year, the actual value of customers reducing their demand is much higher than 30 cents. So it can be up to, I think in the Ausgrid network, it's $42.50 has been calculated as the long run marginal cost of a kilowatt hour of customer consumption. So there is a so basically dynamic pricing, what it does is it attempts to resolve that issue. It charges basically in real time what the cost to the network would be, and that really drives efficient consumer behaviour, and can generate, if it's bidirectional and if it's symmetrical, it can also provide a very, very strong incentive for consumers to make use of the batteries and the solar or their vehicles to actually offset the costs that other customers are imposing during those critical times and get remunerated for it. And that's a potentially a very valuable revenue stream that benefits both the network business and the customer. So that's really the sort of what we went into this project to look at. What if network tariffs were generally cost effective? So we selected 6 different pricing structures, which varied in terms of effectively how dynamic they are. So on the left, or on the rows there, we've got 3 different types of network pricing. So we've got conventional unidirectional time of use pricing, which is only applied to imports. The next row, we've got bidirectional pricing, like Sapin and Ausgrid offer, whereby there is a charge or a reward for exports at certain times. And then finally, we look at dynamic pricing, very similar to what's been trialled in Project Edith on the Ausgrid network. And we compared those across those rows. And then in the columns, we had 2 different types of energy pricing. So this is the cost for actually supplying the energy that passes through the network. And in the first column, we've got time of use energy pricing, which is based on the Origin Go tariff, which is a relatively competitive time of use tariff in the market. And dynamic energy pricing based on Amber Electric spot pass-through retail product. And I'd like to acknowledge the information that Amber's provided to us on that process, and also the contribution of Ausgrid in providing information to help us shape our dynamic pricing methodology. So what did we actually model? So we picked a substation on the Ausgrid network called Netford, which is sort of up there in Newcastle, and it has certain characteristics which mean it might actually be suitable for providing this kind of pricing incentive. It has a high number of standalone owner-occupied dwellings, which unfortunately the same cohort that benefit from solar and maybe batteries will also benefit from being able to participate in this, because they'll be able to implement the upgrades of their premises for taking advantage of bidirectional charging. We assume 10% vehicle to grid penetration. So that equates to basically an 8.3 megawatt or 66.5 megawatt hour resource out on that substation, which is obviously the total usable capacity of the battery, not what is necessarily available at any one point in time. We undertook power flow modelling of the critical peak demand week of 6 to 12 March. And in that top right-hand corner, you can see the black line there is the load profile for that week. So peaks, 7-day week starting with the Monday, and the peaks on the Monday. There's a couple of other quite high peaks, which are that occur on the Tuesday as well. So we ran 520 different customers we optimized individually those customers and how they responded in relation to their load profile incentives that they're getting in their vehicle driving schedule, which we had to develop a model to generate synthetic driving schedules for each of those customers. And then we ran that over. We repeated that over 5 years, each with different vehicle availability schedules. So effectively, it was over 3,000 from memory different customer optimization runs. Then in terms of cash flow modeling, we actually we ran it for a year, because obviously this customer is not just, you know, getting charged or rewarded during this week, they're getting charged for a much longer period of time. So we separately ran cash flow modeling based on the same assumptions for October 22 and September 23. That just gets us out of that, you know, the Ukraine crisis and the energy crisis in Australia, and gets us into more kind of normative pricing situation. The tariffs obviously apply to the whole customer load, not just the flex. Noting Alina's comment earlier about the potential for new AEMC proposed rule change to actually separate that out and apply pricing just on the flex and the load component. And obviously these customers have automated, you know, home energy management system. It's assumed that will manage their operation. And the customer in this case set preferences such as they want to maintain a 40% minimum state of charge. That's quite a conservative setting, but we just wanted to make sure that we accounted for the customers' their daily travel, which was and their comfort levels, which is, and the daily travel is based on Australian average. So okay, so what does that look like? So we had 6 scenarios. I'm just going to present scenario 1, which is sort of the least dynamic, and scenario 6, which is the most dynamic. And just sort of, because they just help illustrate what the change is that's happening. So in the figure on the top left, you've got the black line there, which represents the state of charge of the battery. So you can see it's a very regular cycle, daily cycle, because the incentives that the customer is facing is regular. They're basically a time, a daily repeat of pricing of, peak, off peak, and shoulder throughout the course of the day, and that's happening irrespective of the actual network conditions or the wholesale market conditions. So they could be charging for at negative pricing in the wholesale market, or the retailer would be exposed to negative pricing in the wholesale market, and sometimes the retailer would be exposed to extremely high pricing, where open cycle gas turbines are setting a price, and it's hundreds of dollars per megawatt hour, or even thousands of dollars per megawatt hour. And so it's really the customer is effectively has the benefit of price certainty, but the retailer is required to manage their risk exposure, and that increases costs to the retailer, which are passed on to the customer. You can see the charge and discharge cycle. So this is sort of maybe what you would see under a vehicle to home situation, where there's very much focus on self-consumption. At very few times, I think it's only kind of accidental, does the vehicle actually export to the grid in this situation, because the incentives under these arrangements just aren't strong enough to do that. They are strong enough for the customer to want to self-consume during the evening, so they'll export to cover their evening peak pricing. As a result, there's a very small and incidental 0.6 megawatt reduction in substation critical peak demand on that Monday, which you can see in the chart underneath. So the red line is what the substation would have been doing without vehicle to grid. The demand on that substation. The black line is what it's doing after vehicle to grid. Very little change. Overall, you can see there's a very slight reduction during those peak times, and a slight increase in load overnight. Overall, the fixed feed-in tariff under the normal plans you find out in the market means that vehicles that do happen to be home driven, they have very limited incentive to actually increase their load during the day, unless they're being curtailed and they want to make use of their the energy that would otherwise be curtailed if you were a fixed export limit. But I should say that in this case, we actually have applied dynamic export limits to all scenarios, because obviously that's much closer to the future state that we're planning for. So, you know, so the average weekly bill for this customer is $29.41, right? Sorry, average across all the customers in this week. Now that works out about $1,500 a year or so. So that's about what you'd expect for a normal customer, right? It's not a huge amount of value in there. They are getting savings from having that bill. Does reflect that they've got solar. It does reflect that that they're using their vehicle to self-consume in the evenings. So, but it's still pretty high. They've got this enormous resource in their garage. Why are they still paying such high energy bills? So, as I mentioned before, the reason is that they've got this resource which is able to manage their price risk exposure, but they're not using it fully. They're actually also paying the retailer to buy hedge contracts to manage that, and so therefore their energy rates are higher. The networks are also not rewarding efficient charging and discharging behavior. So during those peak times, if the network was willing to pay a bit more than the time use tariff was offering at that time, the customers would have done much more to reduce their demand. But that's not happening. So really, what we've got is underutilization of that EV asset. So if we compare that to scenario 6, which is the most dynamic scenario, you see it looks quite different. So the first thing you notice with the black line up the top is that the charge and discharge cycles, as reflected in this, you know, the blue in the green line, and also the state of charge is the black line, is irregular. It's now still meeting the customer's needs in terms of keeping the vehicle above 40% state of charge, but it's charging and discharging opportunistically depending on the real-time conditions in the market. And those real-time conditions reflect the underlying cost of generation in the wholesale market. And for network pricing, it reflects the marginal cost of an increase of demand at a point in time. In the chart down the bottom, you can see that dynamic pricing. You can see the green line is what the wholesale market is doing, and the pricing axis is on the right. So you can see that on the Monday evening, during that local network critical peak, the electricity spot market also peaked at just below just below 80 cents a kilowatt hour, which is $800 a megawatt hour in that 5 minute interval. You can also see that the network price is flatlining most of the time. It doesn't cost anything to use the network, right, for most of the time, because there is no cost to the network business of customer using the network most of the time, right? Their fixed capital costs are recovered through daily supply charges. That's a sunk cost. It doesn't make any economic sense to make that into their variable charges. Their variable charges are zero most of the time, but during these critical peaks, there's a big spike in the network pricing. In this case, we've got the spike going up to $120. So $1.20 a kilowatt hour, which is about $1,200 a megawatt hour, exactly $1,200 a megawatt hour. And the reason it's so high is because we wanted to make sure that the customer was generating a very firm response that the network could bank on. It could be lower and still generate a firm response, except in the instance where the wholesale market goes in the opposite direction. So the wholesale market goes to minus $1,000 during a demand peak, which is very possible in our instances where that happens, minus $1,000 during a local demand peak. Then the customer would want to start charging their car at that time. So we needed more than a $1,000 incentive in the opposite direction to offset the wholesale market incentive and generate a firm response. So there's a lot of discussion in the paper around the rationale for this and how these issues can be mitigated. So we see a regular cycling, we see state of charge in the comfort range. We see a firm 2.54 megawatt reduction during the peaks, the difference between the red line and the black line down there, which is about 6.29% of reduction from this substation critical peak. Sorry, that's actually 6.29% reduction in relation to the rated capacity of the substation from memory. And we're seeing that the customer is actually getting paid during this week, including all their household, including the solar and their household energy consumption. On average, the customers are getting paid. Now that makes sense because the customer is actually providing a net service to the electricity system during this week. Right? The value, the real value of their participation is actually being compensated. If that customer wasn't there, did not exist, costs to the electricity system would be higher than they would otherwise. And so this customer is now finally getting compensated for the services that they're providing. There's a test in the rules that says that, which says that the networks, so the networks can't pay out effectively for this service more than it would cost them to upgrade the network. Obviously, look, if they pay out, $1 a kilowatt hour annualized over the course of the $1 a kilowatt over the course of the year, but only costs them 50 cents a kilowatt to upgrade the network, they're better off upgrading the network, right? Everyone should agree with that. So that provides sort of a cap on what the networks should be able to pay out. In this case, in our modelling, all 6 scenarios paid out less than the long-run marginal cost, which is $42.50 for this part of the Ausgrid network. That's $42.50 per kilowatt on an annualised basis. I'll come back to that in a second because it's very, it's very achievable to bring that cost down. So outcomes are better because customers are actually able to make use of the resource in their garage to hedge their energy price exposure. They don't need to pay a retailer to hedge for them. They can do that to buy a financial hedge. They can do that with a physical hedge. And also they're getting rewarded by the network for the actual services they're providing. So both of those things greatly bring down costs for the customer. And also bringing down costs for all customers by reducing the peak load and the price pressures on the electricity network. So it's the last slide. So there's a couple of policy and planning implementations I just wanted to mention. I won't be able to discuss all these in a lot of detail. But basically, the key thing is that if we want to get the most efficient participation from all these distributed energy resources in the system, we want to send quite pointy wholesale and network price incentives. There's no way around that. That's basically, unless you want to take control of these customer resources and operate them in a sort of command and control kind of way, which no one is advocating for. So really we need to think about that transition as part of it and bake that into our smart grid architecture design thinking. The second thing is there's no aggregator or VPP in this scenario. You don't actually need VPPs to get optimal value from these distributed energy resources. What you do need is the capacity of customers to respond, and that response can be generated locally by a home energy management system, and there are products on the market that do that today. We also don't need flexibility markets because the purpose of a flexibility market is to compensate for the deficiencies of the underlying pricing structures, whether they're energy prices or whether they're network charges. We've eliminated those underlying inefficiencies, so we no longer need flexibility markets. The native price incentive is actually doing the work. And then technologically, it's actually quite easy to implement this because networks are already building a communications channel through to these distributed energy resources using CCPOS, which the first use case is dynamic operating envelopes. On the forward roadmap for CCPOS development is the addition of a pricing variable to CCPOS. And that's a question of the industry prioritising that as to the timing when that happens. But I would probably say it's a matter of when, not if that occurs. Then going to the pricing rules, there's a lot of prescription in the national electricity rules around how network pricing occurs. Here's a couple of the principles which we've measured ourselves against. So networks must recover their fixed costs of operation. We've achieved that. All the fixed costs of operation are covered through daily supply charges. In this case, we just set it at $1 a day, $365 a year. It's fairly arbitrary. It doesn't affect the operation of the assets, nor should it. So are the V2G customers on dynamic tariffs being properly remunerated or charged? Yes, they are, because they might receive money during those events, those critical events, but that's because that relates to long-run marginal cost savings that are occurring during those events. Those customers are delivering. We've met the benchmark in terms of network payments being less than the long-run marginal cost of network upgrades. Now, only for the dynamic pricing, only just. Like, I think it came through at about $40 compared to $42.80, and it's sort of coincidental. It makes you think there's some rubbery figures there, but it's not. It's just an absolute coincidence that came in just under. Now, one of the reasons why that's so high is because we've had to compensate for these potential countervailing wholesale price movements. But there's ways around that, which I'll get to in a second. Yeah, it's equitable treatment, technology neutral. Anyone can go on these tariffs. It doesn't really have to have particular technology. You just probably wouldn't want to if you didn't have a flexible resource that could manage your price exposure. And the basic export level of 1.5 kilowatts, which cannot be charged for under the rules, was provided for as well. So really, as a result of this analysis, we identified that, well, this issue of networks having to pay $1.20 kilowatt hour is kind of perverse. It's really driven by this arbitrary setting in the national electricity rules that were set by the reliability panel of minus $1,000 per megawatt hour as a market price floor. Now, that price floor is hit basically whenever a coal generator needs to keep running for operational reasons, but so they basically bid it at the market floor to ensure they can continue operating regardless of what the wholesale market actually does. Now that figure is completely arbitrary. If that was increased to minus $500 a megawatt hour, then networks wouldn't have to compensate customers so much for that countervailing price risk. So what could networks do about this? They could basically try and piggyback more of the wholesale prices. They could offer less incentive and piggyback off the wholesale price. Now, most of the time that will be fine. In rare instances, that won't be fine. The customers will be loading during peak demand events. But that's okay for short periods, and networks are designed to be overloaded for short periods. So in some cases, that would be okay. The AMC reliability panel could increase the market price floor. Or we could get into more innovative tariff structures whereby networks provide a critical peak price guarantee, basically a reverse cap, which guarantees customers payment of at least 50 cents a kilowatt hour or some other amount, which would only be really active. They'll basically pay 50 cents a kilowatt hour during those critical peak times. But in the event that the wholesale market went in the other direction, they would also compensate the customer for that countervailing price movement to ensure the customer responds at that time.
That is certainly fascinating. I think that it's very clear that electricity consumption is just going up. We're going to need more and more larger substations, and if we can just have some of these future electric vehicles to grid connected to them, we can reduce substantially the needed expansion and therefore the cost for the consumer. I'm thrilled with all these people being here today, all these experts, not just the presenters, but everybody in the call. I sort of feel that we have every single piece that need to be moved from government, industry, vehicle manufacturers, society in general to unlock our net zero future. And the vehicle to grid has a great role to play on that future. Can I open the floor now to the speakers? So any questions that you have for any of the four presenters, if you can just raise your hand or drop the question in the chat and just introduce yourself quickly, who the question is for, and let's try to make the most out of these 20 minutes or so that we have to get the panel going. So we have David. there's a hand up, and
yeah, thank you very much.
Tackle Vanny following.
Okay, thank you. I put my hands up when Jon was speaking, so the question was really aimed at Jon, but I'm happy to get all people if they have views to provide the response. In general, we've said in the past that when wholesale prices are lower, costs of energy are lowest, the network costs are lowest, they kind of at the same time. Yeah, there might be some differences, but kind of it's all driven by maximum demands on energy, maximum demands on network, kind of the same time. Not necessarily the case, because it's not about maximum demand of energy, it's about supply and demand. What you highlighted, I think, is the brand new paradigm, which, yes, I'd appreciated minimum demand as being an issue now, but I hadn't yet appreciated that you could actually get the times when we're absolutely throttled by too much energy in the system that we want to get rid of desperately, at the same time as the network desperately wants something the other way around. And that seems to me to be a bigger problem than just V2G. And I appreciate your thoughts on that, Jon, and if others have got thoughts as well.
Yeah, so there's a whole bunch of reasons why you might change the market price floor. Because there's other issues with interregional flows which can reverse and create costs for consumers as well, and other people are expert in that, so they're not me. This is just one factor, but I would say that negative prices don't always reflect an overabundance of energy in the system. Sometimes they just reflect, kind of perversity of aggregate bidding behaviour. Sometimes everyone rushes in because they want to get a piece of the action. But they get exposed because the prices, everyone sort of races to the bottom, so to speak. So yeah, it's an issue. I think the reliability panel probably they've never really properly evaluated the market price floor. They probably need to do that and think about the implications in a more kind of variable energy environment.
Awesome. Daniel, I think you're up next.
Yeah, thanks again. This has just been incredibly fascinating to listen to. But I wanted to get a panel's thoughts on. Heard a lot about passenger vehicles, residential applications, but I'm keen to hear what panel's thoughts are on, say, trucking, and if we've got 100,000 trucks on the roads in Australia, each with 500 kilowatt hour batteries, will we see a future where truck drivers get a notification on an app saying the price is spiking, and then they pull into a particular truck station and help with demand issues? And is there scope for more control over that type of a situation rather than the complexity involved in a residential situation?
Yeah, interesting question. Sorry, I'll start talking for that one. So there are examples like I think someone mentioned it in comments, and we talked about it with some of our reports. School buses in the US, vehicle to grid school buses is a thing. They're it makes sense for them because those buses are used for school pickup and school drop off and not in between. So there's a lot of time where they're parked where they can do that. I think. It's my reflections on the REVS trial and other vehicle to grid trials internationally is that fleets are actually harder than houses to like residential customers, because for residential customers you're convincing one person that vehicle to grid's a good idea. For fleets you're convincing several people that vehicle to grid's a good idea. So the insights I've had from international people who are running trials is that the lead generation process for an organisation is really, really long, because you've got to get them to do their internal stakeholder management before it can happen. Yeah, I think it's interesting because people do talk of this idea of, if you have a vehicle to grid vehicle, you kind of almost have a second distribution network because you can plug in to charge in a different place, you can plug in to discharge. I think the practicalities of a truck driver getting paid to sit around while their vehicle does grid management, I'm not convinced that will work, if I'll be honest. But maybe it will. Well, it's one way to find out, right? Give it a go and see what happens. the practicalities of that are probably challenging.
I would agree, Laura, if I could just add, the conversations that we have with commercial fleet operators who operate prime movers and similar style vehicles are incredibly challenged at the moment around a charging scenario that doesn't include return to base. So I think until the public infrastructure is built out and designed to support logistics fleet operations such that the vehicles don't need to return to base, we could probably start to consider how those distributed solutions might stack up in a way commercially that would benefit disruption or perhaps unreliable provision of service in terms of goods delivery. But I think more likely there would be alternate models in the distribution network that support better.
Right. Just before we go to Trill, who's got their hand up, we might just take a question from the chat. This might be another one for you, Alina and Laura. Karthik has asked, does anyone know if there's been any research on the impact to EV battery degradation versus the V2G services it provides? Laura, I'm not sure if that was a feature of the REVS project.
Yeah, well, we didn't specifically look at battery degradation from practical trial because FCAT frequency control has such rare events that you're not going to notice it. The jury still seems to be a little bit out about what the impact of vehicle to grid is on battery health. So there's this thing of you are charging and discharging, which makes heat, which makes wear, but this kind of things that lead to battery wear include batteries being fully charged a lot of the time. So having a lower state of charge can potentially be a good thing for battery health too. So I think the best I can say is jury's still out, and it'd be really good to try to work this out, I guess, based on practical experience from projects where there's a more dynamic relationship between the battery and the grid.
Yeah. Awesome. Okay, well, let's go to Trill, who has their hand up on the call. Unmute.
Hey, everyone. So just to clarify, my name is Bunny.
Sorry.
That's okay. Thackrell is my surname. So I've known a few people here in this call, so really grateful to have this conversation, and thank you so much for arranging this call and also providing what's been happening on the vehicle to grid space. So I'm currently working in the for City Power, Power Core, and United Energy in the role of the non-network solutions. And my first question is pointed towards Jon Sibley in your latest pack just now. So many thanks for sharing that. My question is around, firstly, just want to clarify, what do you mean by the dynamic pricing? I assume it's a type of tariff that effectively 100% cost reflective on the grid conditions. And so I would assume that's something that's not quite there yet at the moment. Secondly, as well, in Victoria, historically, time of use tariff has been very unpopular. Even when we did introduce time of use tariff, customers would typically shift back immediately into a flat tariff arrangement. And so with that in mind, for most of us in this call, we understand how it works, and most of us can know how to manage those price changes throughout the day. But for the general population out there, how do you think is the best way in order to integrate dynamic pricing and get that adopted a lot more? Thanks.
Yeah, great question. So, so in terms of dynamic pricing, yes, you're correct. So it basically is a pricing which tries to be genuinely cost reflective effectively in real time. And so that means zero price most of the time for using the network. And then depending on how close the network, in this case the substation, is to its rated capacity, prices increase linearly in proportion to as it gets closer to substation capacity. So I think from memory, after 80% of substation loading, it increases from 0 to $1.20 per kilowatt hour. So look to Project Edith on the Ausgrid network for a lot more detail about how that's been trialed in the real world. In terms of the popularity of time of use pricing, so It is partly national, partly a very Victorian thing. So I was managing energy policy in the ACT when we implemented the power of choice reforms, and we didn't get a blip, and no one cared about smart metering or time use pricing in Victoria. The whole thing blew up and became a big deal. There's a bit of recovery in Victoria to happen from that. Overall, we're seeing a continuing trend, a very steady trend towards the adoption of time of use pricing. It's not happening very quickly. But we don't need everyone to be on pointy pricing. We don't need everyone to have batteries or solar. We don't need everyone to we only need a subset of the population to uptake this technology and enjoy the risk, I guess, of participating in this new market to provide the sort of the efficient outcome for the network as a whole. So I would say that you've got to think of the population as being quite a diverse one, and there will be always people who absolutely have no interest, will never participate in this stuff, and a bunch of people who want to get into it. And really over time, what you see is as the conversation matures and as the products mature in the market, adoption gradually creeps out, and that's what we've seen with solar. It's what we've seen with batteries. So over time, I think we'll get there.
That's great. Okay. Maybe just before we go to Tim, Michael's got a question in the Q&A asking our panel what the next steps for building regulations might be and how can we build on the readiness requirements introduced into the National Construction Code in 2022. Wondering, Laura, maybe you kick us off?
Yeah, I remember reading that at the time, but I'm trying to extract the details from the dark depths of my mind, and so far it's not grabbing. But yeah, like certainly in the REVS trial, getting the chargers installed was hard because the buildings were never really built thinking that EV charging, never mind vehicle to grid, was going to connect to them. So I would say that, when we're building new buildings, we should be building them assuming that there will be chargers connected at least most of the car parks. So, that's laying conduit at least so that you can run cables at some point in the future, for example, reduces the cost quite a bit. So, sorry, phone call. So, yeah, that's kind of what I guess my main thoughts are.
Yep.
Yeah.
Awesome. Got no other points for the panel. Tim, we're running a little tight on time, so I'll give you one question.
I think it's not clear from what Jon's talked about so far whether he's talking about a subscription type revenue that includes a certain amount of capacity or that it's dynamic pricing that affects the whole load. And I think if we unpack that, it might help a little bit. But I think there's a big focus around consumers' savings, and there's another question in the chat that talks to the fact that this is an integrated thing. This is also about solar and about shifting load that people are doing as part of solar and things as well. And we can see an awful lot of flexibility already being exercised by that part of the community. It's how we get the rest of the people on board. And I'm just wondering how the panel thinks about that.
Yes. It's probably the answer, but I can clarify that the dynamic pricing applies to the whole load, and even still the customers are better off.
I don't think that's going to have a lot of people rushing out to do it.
Well, that will need to be productized, so it could be productized in a subscription service or anything like that. There's lots of ways in which that becomes a marketing exercise in terms of how to deliver that underlying value to the customer.
Can I jump in too, Jon? I think, Tim, where we're at in the market now is identifying a business case to make an investment in market arrangements such that we can offer this functionality and then with it consumer choice. So the intention here is in order to structure the market so that we can realize the value of coordinated distributed energy solutions and ensure that each cog in the value chain is working such that the maximum value can be realized. We have to lay the foundation for what benefits might exist when that's actually working, and then the market will shift accordingly, and through that products vehicles will become available and consumers will have choice. And at that point, they will be able to utilize or create their own energy ecosystem in a way that suits them if they have a basis for wanting to do that. So I think it's a little bit about interest, a little bit about benefit, and a little bit about wanting to participate in that manner when the market conditions are now favorable.
I just challenge everyone to think about ICT and other technology being involved that's focused on the business case of delivering consumer savings rather than the current business models of energy participants, which is around demand response, services, energy markets, etc. And so what if the consumer can improve his energy cost efficiency and then better use of their networks?
I think very good points, Tim. We might just move along, given we're running short on time. We want to give everyone an opportunity to ask their questions. Peter's got his hand up. Want to go next?
Yes, thank you. My question's for the whole panel. I don't expect you all to answer, of course. Based on Ezra and Jon's findings, and in light of the AEMC draft determination related to flexible trading, I was interested if the customer can access more or less value from their future bidirectional charges if its operation and market settlement is segregated from the rest of their household load?
Interesting question. I don't know, like it kind of feels to me like that's kind of like a how. So, you know, you could structure a single meter or 2 meters to provide the same kind of thing, right? So it might make it easier for an organisation to create a value proposition that works for vehicle to grid if you have a separate meter. But it kind of feels like the value's there no matter what the metering arrangement is. So there should be some way of making that happen.
100% agree.
Awesome.
I think you can do all that under the current arrangements. I think just the AMC change just provides another way of doing it.
All right. We have a question from Maya. Go ahead. Oh, no, looks like she's dropped off. Oliver?
Thanks, just snuck in there at the end. I noted the comment earlier on, Alina, about we have to get the policy settings right with NEVs for this to really work, and also the commentary around you know, we need to be able to identify what the business cases are for these different applications of, you know, V2G, so that we can actually segment the market and get maximum value, and this will then create choice. That's the straightforward. I feel like it's a straightforward way of looking at it, but from an equity standpoint, how do we make sure, as we're going through the process of NEVs being designed and these policy inputs, that we are designing not just for the, you know, the greatest amount of choices necessarily, the most profitable choices, but also designing for the most equitable outcome in terms of involving people and actually being able to use this as an opportunity to take great ownership of their own energy or transportation. So it's a very broad question to the panel, but you know, I feel like the equity standpoint comes in quite a lot. Laura, I know you're into this, so.
Absolutely. Yeah, this is a fair part of my life, thinking about this kind of thing. So I'm more than happy to. I mean, I think for me, there are a couple of things that come to mind. Like one of them is the system that we have in energy at the moment is techno-economic, which means values like equity and stuff kind of seem to sit on the outside of the core of the system. I think an active question and something that's worthwhile for us to think about as an industry is how do we bring some of these values like equity closer to the centre? Because when we talk about vehicle to grid, batteries, VPPs, they're kind of like you have money to get money, which is kind of inherently a bit inequitable, if you ask me. So, you know, that's kind of step one, like bringing equity into the centre probably means that we think a little bit more about people who don't have vehicles, don't have you know, ability to install chargers at home today, live in poor energy efficiency houses, that kind of thing. The other thing that comes to my mind as well is like, well, how do we decide what the right energy system is? And that comes back to justice, right? Like, how are we including the disadvantaged consumers out there in these formative energy system discussions so that we can make sure that we're building the right thing? So I don't know if I can answer you as to say we should do this, other than to say we probably need to be kind of a bit inclusive and reflexive in our processes and look for these kinds of inequity things so that we can think them through in a bit more detail. A lot of the time when we see talk of these things, there's the idea that longer term energy prices should reduce, and, you know, that should be the case, although it's still a case of, we're paying people with money now with the promise at some point in the future, people without money might see some kind of benefit. So, that's probably an effect to think about as well.
Just make a
So
quick comment on that.
that's great. And we are coming now towards the end of this 2-hour session. We could have done 4 hours. It's not going to be enough. We have before I thank the speakers and we have one more for Maya. If you're ready, Maya, now.
Thank you.
There you
Thanks. They were connected to my earpods in my pants somewhere. So thanks for taking my question. Thanks again to the whole panel. What a great presentation, and to hear from all your perspectives. On the commercial fleet, I guess this is a question and a proposition, kind of open. But in the context of V2X integration with commercial fleets, could you elaborate or quickly comment on the pivotal role of mobile meters and their significance in facilitating that seamless engagement and operational efficiency? Or as we move away from more aggregated models or more subscription-based models, do you see the need for mobile meters diminish?
I see Laura is smiling. Do you want to take that one?
When people say mobile meters, I think, well, we haven't even got non-mobile meters working very well yet. They still don't send you data in real time, right? So that feels like there might be a little way to go before we have meters that can disconnect and reconnect at different parts of the grid working well. It's absolutely something to think about. I just feel like it's probably there are other things we need to sort in metering in general. So I was just smiling.
Ausgrid's developed a concept called the floating EME, which they proposed under the Smart Grid Smart Cities trial, if people remember that far back. But it followed around. It is an incredibly complex proposition. I don't think it's adds a lot of value.
Thanks, Jon. Alina, any final thoughts, clever ideas, recommendations for the future?
Oh, look, I'll just say I think we have a desire to think to the future of what the opportunity can be, and through that introduce lots and lots of solutions that some might seem really complex. So one thing I would recommend is just in the immediate term, to the extent that those of us are wanting to encourage vehicle to grid, to think about how we can make it simpler for people to understand and start to help gain traction in education. So just in response to the comment earlier about the consumer point of view, I think this concept is actually way out there for most people. So I would encourage you to think about what can we do in terms of low-hanging fruit to sort of start to bring it into normalization and acceptance. Because if we can do that, I think that acceleration will happen when the tech is ready.
Awesome. Thanks, Alina. I'm going to ask everyone to just click on this QR code that is on the screen to provide feedback. This is really important for us in terms of continue delivering this type of webinars. We really need to know if we are doing a good work and this is something that is of interest to you, so we can continue doing it. And finally, thank you, Alina, Ezra, Jon, Laura, for the beautiful presentations, and everyone that was involved in this call today. Let's make the Vehicle to Grid future ready. We're almost there. Everything is sorted. Another 5 minutes and everything is already there. And finally, just shout out, because we have Arena is open for business. So if you have good ideas, don't be shy and just click on transport@arena.gov.au and send us your best and most ambitious ideas, and we will be very happy to progress them. And thank you everyone for coming today, and let's catch you the next time.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Adrian. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Adrian.
Thank you very
Destiny
much.
and all.